Welcome back to the History on the Rocks podcast. This is your host, Cody, and today we have an exclusive interview. Our guest today is a #1 New York Times best-selling author. His works include Horse Soldiers, the basis for the Jerry Bruckheimer-produced movie 12 Strong, and our featured story for this podcast's 4-part series. In Harm's Way, a New York Times notable book and the definitive account of the sinking, rescue, and valor of the USS Indianapolis crew, and The Odyssey of Echo Company, which is a Military Times Best Book of the Year and recipient of the Society of Midland's Authors Best Nonfiction Book Award. Please welcome to the History on the Rocks podcast, Doug Stanton. That's good. So, Doug, the first thing I wanted to ask you is how did you come about writing the story of Horse Soldiers? What was your inspiration for the book?
The inspiration for writing Horse Soldiers occurred to me when I saw an article in Time magazine by a journalist named Alex Perry, who'd been trapped in the Kali fortress during a momentous battle of November 25th, 2001. Alex wrote a really good account of what had happened to the people inside the fortress. And in the middle of that, we find out that an American from California named John Walker Lind has found himself in the middle of this firefight, having been imprisoned or sequestered in the fortress itself, and then questioned by a CIA officer named Mike Spann. And it was that face-off between these two Americans that became worldwide news. And Mike was tragically killed in an uprising shortly after his questioning of Lind. And I wondered, how did Mike Spann end up there, and how did John Walker Lind end up there? And of course, the book casts a much bigger net than that. It goes all the way back to really the 80s and 90s in Afghanistan. But that was really it, by reading this fantastic piece by Alex Perry.
Yeah, and in the book, the John Walker Lind story totally caught me off guard, because here I'm sitting down and I'm like, all right, I'm gonna read about special forces, and then there's this backstory there of an American who is operating inside the Taliban, and just as a reader, I was like, whoa, I've actually never heard of this.
He'd come from California to study Arabic in Yemen, and had found he'd slid from kind of one community, each perhaps more radicalized than the other, and then found him as part of Osama bin Laden's brigade, and there he was.
Yeah, that was wild to me. I had no idea. So you started there. John Walker Lind was actually the first kind of hearing of this.
Well, it is, because on November 25th, 2001, when Mike Spann, CIA officer, is killed in this firefight along with his colleague Dave Tyson, both CIA paramilitary officers working in Afghanistan as part of the pilot team that came in and earlier that fall to lead the way. And we can talk about that in just a moment. No one knew that they were. It had been such a light footprint and executed so quickly that, number one, so we do have American Special Forces soldiers in Afghanistan. The CIA is working there, and on top of that, there's this American citizen. And when that happened, it became worldwide news. And as one of the kind of coincidences of writing this book is that I later became friends with Shannon Spann, who is Mike Spann's widow. Shannon is now remarried, but when her husband Mike was killed, and they had a son just months old, Jake, she became the first real public face of the first American to be killed in post 9/11 combat. And so that's how the world really, so the curtain was pulled back on this response to September 11th, 2001. Since I've become acquaintances with Jake, and he's grown up to be a fine young man and with a big career ahead of him. But that the book is not by any stretch about John Walker Lindh at all. But that's, that was the news of the day, 23 years ago.
Yeah, and it's definitely like a kind of a bombshell moment, especially for the American public to kind of hear that after, 9/11.
Right. Exactly.
And what did you want to go back and touch on?
I think I was talking about Mike Spann, another person named J.R. Seeger, who has since become our friend, and Alex Hernandez, same way. They were part of this pilot team tasked by the Central Intelligence Agency when 9/11 happened to go in and reignite these old communication lines that had been lingering since the 80s and 90s, when we had armed the Mujahideen to get rid of the Soviets.
Could you explain more about the Mujahideen?
Well, I know that you touched on it, and you gave it a good description of it in episode 1 here for you. You have these tribal groups, the Hazaras, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and the Pashtuns, who are part of this inter-country civil war with each other post-Soviet withdrawal. So the Soviets leave. There's a power vacuum, and you have these groups fighting each other, and for a number of reasons. The Pashtuns being the supposed, well, not supposed, but being a majority of and in leadership positions. President Karzai was a Pashtun. The Hazaras, on the other hand, being a minority. Hazaras being, the Taliban, really went after the Hazaras and slaughtered them by the thousands. The Taliban being Pashtuns. So out of this chaos and this maelstrom, the Taliban arise as a quasi police force, or a quasi center point to still the civil war in the country. They begin to mete out justice. And at one point, if you had something to take to market, you would be in your truck driving down the road. You'd maybe stop 2 or 3 times to pay a toll at different stations run either by a single tribal group or maybe various tribal groups. And the Taliban began to get rid of the quote corruption. But then, of course, they became corrupt themselves. Perhaps they always were, but what we do know is that they were always extremely, to be repetitive, extreme in their interpretation of the Quran and Sharia law, and et cetera. And so that's a snapshot of how you go from these different tribal groups to the Taliban owning maybe 90% of the country in September of 2001, after more than a decade of civil war. You referenced earlier in another part, Cody, about Ahmad Shah Massoud, who is a Tajik fighting up in the northern part of Afghanistan.
Correct, yes.
And he's actually one of the few holdouts. He is, I think, the last holdout against the Taliban. And he is assassinated on September 9th, I believe, 2001. And to cut the head off of any kind of resistance. And what the Taliban and Al Qaeda obviously didn't anticipate was the entrance of the U.S. into the conflict at that time.
That makes complete sense. That's kind of a, that whole 80s, 90s Afghanistan Soviet conflict is just I think the precursor to a lot of things that go on in Afghanistan. And then, yeah, like you just said, not realizing that the United States was going to be a player in the future.
There's a book called that a lot of the Special Forces soldiers I interviewed read called The Bear Went Over the Mountain, for anyone who wants to know more about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And then, of course, if you want to read about those early days of the Mujahideen and the arming of them, either read or watch Charlie Wilson's War, a movie with Tom Hanks.
Okay.
That covers how we armed certain parts of Afghan society who later became the Taliban, and not all did, but those are two interesting places to start.
Great suggestions, especially for me, and I know people who are interested in this topic as well. I'm definitely going to have to check both of those out because that's the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is something that I'm knowledgeable about, but the in-depth part I couldn't tell you much. So I think that's a really interesting topic for that time period. You just mentioned, and I think this is a good segue into this question. You mentioned the Special Forces members that you interviewed for this book. So one of the questions I was very curious about, just reading your book in general, and constantly in my head is, how did you gather all this information to write this story, and who were those people that you reached out to get all of this? There's a lot of detail in this book.
Yeah, it's based on oral histories, interviews, over 100 interviews with basically every element that was on the ground from infiltration in October 2001 of Special Forces until exfiltration, which would be in 2002, because then they were going to Iraq in 2003. I'd written a book called In Harm's Way about the sinking of the USS Indianapolis in World War II, which people may have read. And it was that book which looked deeply at the humanity of the people involved. And that book is about survival at sea. And it's an epic story. And this is the ship, the Indianapolis, that delivered the atomic bomb components.
Correct.
Et cetera. And the men survived. The captain was court-martialed, Captain McVeigh. And it's an epic story of survival. And I was interested in what it felt like to be there, how this experience had changed these World War II veterans, et cetera. I'm always interested in, the details of the technology and so on, but that really was my point of entry. And so when it came to horse soldiers, I really wanted to know, because no one had done it before, how they executed this very light footprint mission with two teams of 12 people, then with some Air Force combat controllers attached, of course, led first by teams of CIA officers, but it was very, very light. We're talking hundreds, not thousands, which is what, if you'd gone to the Pentagon on September 11th, 2001, after the attack in America, there was no plan on the shelf for Afghanistan. I mean, we could have executed a large overland invasion of 50, 60,000 troops, but that would have taken months. And if we can remember, America wanted an answer now. And also, we knew that it was going to be I think we knew it was going to be an unconventional war that is not fought with a defined front line. So when I showed up, I wrote a letter to the press affairs office in New York City for the U.S. Army, explaining what I'd written and that I was interested in learning more about these Special Forces soldiers, whom I'd learned about through this reveal of John Walker Lind and the CIA at this battle called Kali Jangi. They referred me to, I believe, Fort Bragg, where I met a general named Jeff Lambert, now retired, and he referred me to Lieutenant Colonel John Mulholland, now General John Mulholland, retired, who was the commander of 5th Group Special Forces at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. So and then I ended up going also to MacDill Air Force Base, where SOCOM is. I went to the 10th Mountain Division in Fort Drum, New York, because 10th Mountain Soldiers of the regular Army were a quick reaction force for College Engie. I went to Afghanistan. I found Afghan National Army soldiers on the other side of the wire at College Engie, and so went over and interviewed them. It's just thousands of hours of interviews. Some at my home. When I asked, Mark, then Major Mark Mitchell, now retired, what he did the day that he left for Afghanistan. And if you've seen the movie 12 Strong, which is based on my book Horse Soldiers, you can see them get all spun up, and they're shopping at REI and et cetera, and Walmart, buying batteries and sleeping bags, because it's happening so quickly that they have to kind of police themselves up and buy these things on the open market. And we can talk about that in a minute, but which Special Forces is uniquely trained to do differently than the conventional Army soldier. We can make that distinction in a little bit. But when I asked Mark what he did that day, I didn't ask him like, well, what was your operational plan, or what I said, what did you do? And he says, well, I took my daughter to McDonald's, I think, and we had a Happy Meal, and then I went home and packed my knapsack. And I said, oh, what's your knapsack? He said, well, my toothbrush and U.S. News and World Report. You always ask the next question. The details are what make all of us come alive to each other.
Absolutely.
And so I was interested in the journey, the mental, the professional, psychological journey, and the really physical hardship of this journey of these men as they moved across the landscape in Afghanistan, and really did achieve a unique victory. I wasn't interested, a chance to put a button on this. I do remember talking with a weapons sergeant on one of the teams, Mike Elmore. Like, Mike said, I can't tell you what how many, what the batteries weighed that we carried in our radios. And we were at Fort Campbell, I think, just talking in the team room on the post there. And I'm like, Mike, I don't really want to know. What do you mean? Well, if I tell you how much they weigh, then the enemy will know how many calories we have to consume how much energy we expend to carry that much weight. And I said, listen, I don't want to know that. What I want to know is what you did in the cave when you were getting ready to ride on these horses against the Taliban. He goes, oh, well, I was sketching vinyl album record covers in my notebook for either AC/DC or Black Sabbath or something. I said, okay, that's the detail. That's the thing that we as neighbors, as Americans, we can relate to that. And then we can begin to see who you are as you do this really unique and, outstanding kind of maneuver in Afghanistan. So that's how I got the information. Just ask and ask and ask.
Yeah, and like you said, thousands of hours of interviews. I imagine, just taking notes and notes and notes about those types of details. And reading that part in the book about REI and all the they have to get all this equipment so fast. I believe you refer to it as they were given the Pentagon's golden credit card or something like that.
Yeah, I think a couple of the guys had referred to it is that. I do want to stress for all of us here is that how unique the situation is. If any of us have ever been in the Army or worked for corporations, you think back how rare it is that your boss or senior person gives you the latitude to think like that on your feet, especially in the Army or any kind of the armed forces, because that, the chain of command is a sacred thing, and things start to go awry when people are moving outside their own taskings,
Sure.
to take initiative. But the training of special forces actually is meant to allow them, enable them to be able to think for themselves.
And operate how they see fit.
How they see fit, to be able to operate in ambiguous situations. You asked how I got this information. I spent maybe 5 days at Camp McCall,
Mm-hmm.
doing something called Robin Sage, and any of those who were in SF or maybe SEAL, or every elite group has this exercise where you really are put through the ringer in real time. And so you had a group of young captains, young teams. They're trying to earn their Green Beret, so they hadn't been minted yet, and they come into this place called Pineland, near Fort Campbell, and maybe for a week or 2 weeks they live this real time scenario where they are the special forces team. They link up with a quote warlord who is the running Pineland.
Okay.
Well, not running Pineland, but he wants to overthrow Pineland. So Pineland is his own government, and the SF teams and the warlord, the insurgents, right? They're going to have an insurgency to take over Pineland. So how do you do that? Well, you get infiltrated in the dead of night by pickup truck. In this case, in Afghanistan, it was the Chinook helicopter.
Right.
And you walk into the what's called the G Chiefs, or the guerrilla warlord, the quote warlords camp, and you try to build rapport with these fighters, many of whom might be farmers or otherwise professional soldiers, but it's grassroots, homegrown. Now in Pineland, when I was there, these roles are actually played by local people.
Oh, really?
Who play in the community. The warlord was a really interesting guy who was actually in the Sante raid in Vietnam. He was playing because he knew the drill, and he knew what special forces is and was, and so he was playing the guerrilla chief. And his job is to make it very difficult and challenging for these young American teams to actually build rapport with his group.
He has that in-depth knowledge to challenge them in that sense.
To show up with a gift, and then you get invited into the campfire at night, to build rapport, to try to ask. So you and I, like, if we're sitting here talking,
mm-hmm.
if I were coming into your house and I was the SF team, and you were say you had your own cadre of fighters, I would want to know, Cody, like what your religion is, how much money you had, what grievances you had,
right,
what language you spoke, what was your religion. I would know all these things. What are your relationships? How, everything about you. I do all this area study before I show up, and I would try to find common cause with you. One of the mottos of SF is to work by, with, and through. So by, with and through. So
mm-hmm.
you and I are going to figure out a common goal, and we're going to work together, turn our attention to get it. And it's very hard to do. And the conventional army is fighting symmetrical battles,
sure,
using kinetic means, blowing up things up, breaking things, shooting things. And these guys actually dine out on the fact that they don't have to shoot their weapon. It might actually be like kind of a Jedi and do a mind meld with their opponent and get things to come to a resolution without any violence. And that's a very different approach to war fighting, and that's what made the story unique.
Yeah, that so a little, like microcosm from your book, like that kind of like gaining rapport stuff just reminds me of the Russian vodka for General Dostum.
Yeah. Oh, right.
Like those little things, right? That kind of get your foot in the door, and to be able to find out that, that kind of information and build that cohesion that you need to.
Exactly.
Which in Afghanistan, I would imagine, is just, especially with the language barrier, has to be so much more difficult for these guys during this operation.
So Special Forces spends a lot of time in Monterey at the language school studying different languages
mm-hmm.
for which their group is tasked to go into. And in this case, because it just happened, no one had been studying Dari etc., or Persian, but there were enough Russian speakers and well, there were Arabic speakers on the team, and they had translators that they could communicate with the Afghans. What I want, this thing about building rapport. So we started the conversation by saying, there were different groups: the Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, and Pashtuns,
Right.
and they fighting each other. So you and I, now we're on this special forces team. We enter into this village, and we try, and the CIA did this. This was one of their main tasks before the main SF contingent arrived, was to go through and make sure all these different groups were going to work together in common cause to push out the Taliban. If they were going to stop fighting each other, and like I said, work by, with, and through each other alongside the special forces soldiers. And so that is to manage that is a very different doctrine
Sure.
in conflict resolution than just the regular army.
Yeah, I would imagine so. I mean, and reading and also reading about that part in the book, like we're talking about, is like this idea of like the Northern Alliance. You have these warlords who are, those, um, they're bitter rivals, like you're talking about, right?
Yeah, they're bitter rival. Yes, they are, but it floats. I think it gets bitter and less bitter, and then it modulates over time. But to know how to think ahead was part of their training.
Mm-hmm.
What the special forces are looking for is a person who is resilient, not necessarily the fastest runner or the biggest weightlifter, etc.,
Right.
but the person who can pop up after defeat and keep going, and who's adaptable, um, who isn't rattled by ambiguous situations. I was watching one of these training sessions during Robin Sage at Camp McCall, and this this retired special forces soldier who had been part of this famous raid called the Sante raid, which would be an interesting maybe episode for you at some point in Vietnam. He turned to the American captain and he said, show me what's in your pocket." And the young captain like just really froze. Now I should say that there are instructors in the bushes and black t-shirts watching this role play go out, and they're kind of guiding the exercise and communicating with the G chief, who's a civilian, and etc. And so the instructors had told the G chief that this young captain had a bit of intelligence in his pocket. And so when the chief said this, he didn't know what to do, because he wants to build rapport. He wants to be invited into the campfire. He wants to work with this person, but he can't disclose this intelligence because that is that's not allowed.
Right.
And so the guerrilla chief, he says, well, if you don't show it to me, I'm going to beat one of my men. And he raises a cane and he's about to strike them. And the captain is just really having a hard time figuring this out. What should he do?
Right.
Should he save? He can't, because if he is witness to this human rights violation, he has to leave,
Okay.
and he doesn't want to leave. But at the same time, he can't disclose what's in his pocket. There's really not a right answer here.
Right.
But so the instructors came out of the shadows here and stopped the exercise. It was just fascinating. They had a talk with the team and said, now listen here, you have a problem. But the lesson of this is that this problem didn't start in this moment. It started the other day when you didn't notice that the guerrilla chief did X, or he was watching you in this way. That anything that happens to you is not really just a matter of that moment. As a special forces soldier, you have to be supremely aware of well, really at heart, the culture and the rhythms and the needs and wants of your counterpart, so that you're extremely aware of and try to anticipate what they might do, what they might ask for, so you don't find yourself at this crossroads here where you don't really have a good outcome.
Right.
And that's I just found that really to write these interview had really fascinating lessons about life itself, because what they're really trying to train these people to do is to get along with people.
Yeah, no, and that makes total sense because like the situation that you're explaining there is it's kind of a psychological effect too. You're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, and there's you're in a situation that there may not be a right answer or a right situation or right path to take, but you're gonna have to choose one. And what might the best one be?
Yeah, that's right. And if you run through these scenarios enough, and you study up on um, the rule of lawfare, you can hopefully make the better decision. But it takes a long time to, when Afghanistan kicked off in 2001, these special forces soldiers were 35, late 30s. They're older. They're very seasoned Army soldiers,
Right.
and so they had a lot of world experience. They were WASP.
Because many of these men were part of Desert Storm, correct?
Yes, some were as young captains or lieutenants. Right, exactly right. Yeah, they'd come out of West Point, or they'd enlisted and then were part of Desert Storm, and opted into special forces, which you have to volunteer for and then pass all this very rigorous, mental and kind of physical training to get in.
Right. Yeah, I've like buds for the Navy SEALs and Green Berets. I've read some things on their training and exercises and stuff, and I'm glad
Yeah.
I'm glad they go through it and they're willing to, because I'm like, wow, the physical component and the mental component of what special forces and operators do is some of it to me is just unfathomable to kind of the human mind. And I think that is what makes a lot of these men that we're talking about very unique as human beings and as soldiers in a story like this that we're talking about.
Very unique. But in case of the class of special forces soldier I met in 2003 and onward, was very humble. They looked often like your high school biology teacher who worked out. There was nothing about them, because often they also would grow their hair out and change their grooming
Sure.
and to go somewhere and work covertly.
Right, because then you look like your point is to blend in and not look
Right.
soldier-esque.
And the thing I can say about 12 Strong, the movie, is they did not turn it into a Rambo movie or a SEAL movie. They really, the SEALs do one kind of thing. They're much more kinetic. They're much more direct action. They would be infiltrated, and when they had to go in and attack and raid a camp and take it down. We put in the SF teams in 2001 because we wanted to build common cause with these 4 ethnic area groups that were fighting each other, and push them against the Taliban, because we didn't have we couldn't bring in an army just to fight them, quote, on our own. And
Right.
also the reality is this was the Afghans' fight. They were a leader named Mahakek Hazara, from the center of the country. When he heard of 9/11, he said, finally, the Americans are going to come, because they had, the reason the book is called Horse Soldiers, one thing we haven't talked about is they had been fighting this guerrilla war against a superior force,
Right.
i.e. the Taliban, which also had a small air force. They had tanks and armor and more Toyota trucks. These various groups had hardware too, ammunition, weapons, but a lot of them were mounted on horses.
Right.
And that was because, so they would fight a battle to take ground, and they would they would charge under. We'll talk about Abdul Rashid Dostum just for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
He would lead a charge across open ground, take a Taliban defended position, which should be defended with, armor and tanks. And the interesting thing is that the modern weapon could not adjust its fire quickly enough to take out the horses.
Right.
So the animal was moving and adapting and changing more rapidly than the armor could respond. So when the horse charge overwhelmed the Taliban line, it would retreat. The tanks would turn, the trucks would turn. They'd go to the next hill, and then turn around, and then they would begin to blast the Northern Alliance, off the hill they had just taken.
Okay. Yeah.
So that
I'm sorry. I don't mean to cut you off, but like when you talk about Dostum in the book, he honestly he's one of my and I'm going to use the word characters for lack of a better term, but he's one of my favorite characters in the book because of like what you're talking about right now. This horses riding into battle. I think there was one part where you're talking about he's riding past his own men into a charge, and it to me it's just like here's this leader, and he's like, come on boys, like almost, the guys are almost embarrassed that he's riding past further than them into this Taliban line.
Yeah, there was a one attack they were losing the initiative on, and he turned and went back into it. You're exactly right. He's been on horse because that's their means of transportation. They also can retreat and go places that the trucks can't necessarily go.
Right.
And so yes, that's Dostum, adaptive, opportunistic.
Mm-hmm.
He and no friend of the Taliban. He's from Mazar Sharif, the northern part, which is quote unquote more liberal in its social mores. He women could go to university in Mazar Sharif and etc.
Right.
And so,
ethnically, he's Uzbeki, correct?
that's correct.
Okay.
Now he did work with the Soviets during the Soviet invasion,
mm-hmm.
and then he worked against the Soviets. It was said about Dostum that you could never really have his full loyalty, but you could rent it.
He's very shifty.
Yeah. So I met him. I interviewed. You asked about how I got this information. I interviewed Dostum. I interviewed Atta, who was the Tajik leader in the north. To go to why is it called horse soldiers,
right.
and why special forces, and why were they ideally suited for this?
Mm-hmm.
If you had deployed a brigade of or a couple companies of regular army conventional war soldiers, they landed at Dostum's camp, got out of the helicopter, and he said, we're going to go fight. And the Americans go, how are we going to get there? And he goes, by horseback.
Yeah.
Typically, the conventionally trained soldier would have said, well, we can't do that.
Right.
They would never have been really in their training been confronted with this question. So, but however, the special forces soldier had been. And so while many of them, except Mark Nooch, didn't have much experience or any at all on horseback, they all said, well, certainly we can do that. We're just going to make this up as we go along, keep going with the flow, keep adapting here. Right. And thereby they also building rapport with Dostum because, oh, well, these guys, they're not going to need me to hold their hand. They can keep up. They know what's going on. And what really changed the game, to get to the short of it, is we talked about this horse charge and overwhelming the mechanized line, which would then reattack and win again. Is the Americans came armed with quote smart bombs or JDAMs, which were fitted with GPS mechanisms, which could either using a laser or by punching in coordinates be dropped and then hit these positions. So as just before, for instance, or as the battle or during the battle, this mechanized line of Taliban could be destroyed from the air,
right? Thereby
removing the chance for the Taliban to reattack and take the land back. So, in this manner, the Americans and the Afghans have been moving and taking ground from the south up to Mazar Sharif, which they finally captured on November 9th and 10th of 2001.
Right. The horse component. So my wife and I both. My wife's been riding horses since she was 5. She's got her dad lives in Steamboat, Colorado. They have horses. They live on a big property, and we were literally laughing out loud at some of the interactions between, first of all, the SF on the ground and the pilots above. There's an interaction between them, and I don't remember who it was in the book. I think it might have been Nelson or maybe Mitchell. I'm not sure. But when he says to the pilot, he's like, "We're on horses," and the pilot says back to him like, "You're on what?"
Right.
Like the pilot can't believe what he's hearing, that you're fighting a war on a horse.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's components of the book of how it's written, and you do such a good job. And Audrey and I were talking about this. Like there's like this comedic relief in the middle of these amazingly tense situations.
Well, I mean, yes. I think that's true. This dark humor pervades a lot of these military experiences or any kind of life threatening. But it is true that it turns out that Dostum, while a very serious character, uh, he when he hears a woman's voice
Mm-hmm.
come over the radio from an AC-130
Right.
gunship overhead, which is firing at Taliban. Just it's a massive, extremely destructive platform.
Correct.
You probably remember this from the book. He's shocked because he says the Americans think so little of the Taliban that they've sent a woman to kill them.
Yes.
And I don't know. Well, he then radios that on his walkie-talkie to the Taliban,
Right.
to taunt them. Her name is Allison Black. She's recently retired, and either he or someone gave her the nickname the Angel of Death because there were lots of there were other gunships, but that stuck in his mind. So he was very savvy in using this kind of psychological warfare against the enemy. On the other hand, the SF guys, like we talked earlier about always being one step ahead of your counterpart.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, they were riding into a village, which they had, which the Afghans, because remember, there's 12 a 12-man special forces team.
Right.
There are 2 of those. Then there's a command and control team that comes in. There are CIA officers as well. And then there are other people attached, and there's Air Force combat controllers attached to the special forces team. But it's a small number, and so the Northern Alliance fighters are numbering in the hundreds, and then in each different group. And Dostum wants to raise the American flag on the truck or the John Deere Gator that they're going to ride through in this town on, and the colonel says no.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to raise the flag.
Right.
And Dostum's like, why? He says, well, because that will that will raise the message to everyone. This is an American victory, and it is your victory.
It's your
truly.
victory. That's right.
Anyway, and also the colonel was aware that Dostum would be very happy for people to see that he had the Americans with him.
Right.
So the Americans did not want to be played in that way, because they were also at times over the radio asking the Americans to bomb a certain position on the battlefield. And after they checked it, they realized that really what the person had asked for was for the Americans to bomb an enemy.
Yes.
Like an enemy, and not necessarily the Taliban.
Not necessarily the Taliban, but another enemy of the civil war that's going on. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. A grievance or just, perfect. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, I remember that from the book as well. Like even the pilots above are like, that's a Toyota or a truck. I can't bomb that. And that's not a military vehicle. And he's like, well, he's saying that it's Taliban. So, they had to make sure that, it wasn't a rival faction and it was Taliban before they operated on that.
Right, and that would be the ground elements job,
Mm-hmm.
the special forces team to just to figure out through translators. So we're being told we need to attack this position. Is that really a Taliban position? What what they also told the air was, if you see anything on wheels, it's Taliban, because everything else is either on foot.
Or on a horse. So, on your website, you have a great picture of you. I believe you're sitting at the fortress of Kali
Yeah,
Jangi. Is that correct?
that's correct. Yeah.
What year did you go visit Afghanistan? And I just want to know what that experience was like, um, and how seeing these places incorporated into your writing of the story.
Well, I went back in 2005 for a historical review to go back to the battlefield areas and to interview people who might still be there, who had taken part. And at one point, I found Ali Sarwar in Mazar Sharif, and he'd
Mm-hmm.
been at the Battle of Kalajangi, and he was now in the Afghan National Army. So I walked with Ali all through the fortress, and he narrated the battle for me from his point of view.
Oh wow!
So when you see that in the book, that's Ali talking to me, and me then merging that with the oral histories and the after action reports of the Americans who were in there.
Oh wow!
Um,
That's really cool.
and so that was essential, especially because the battle scene was very big, and then there's a person who gets blown up but not killed. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was just really going person to person and tracking them down by phone or flying to where they were and sitting down for 4 or 5 hours and starting at the beginning. There's that, but going to Afghanistan then just gave me another perspective on the street, talking with young, in this case it was young men who had been there, now working as translators and getting their oral histories. I have a clip somewhere on maybe Facebook, which is just Doug Stanton. That's my author page, of interviewing on the street. Tell me what this looked like in 2001, and then they would. I'm just filming it, and they're saying, well, there would be bodies piled over here. So it was it was invaluable. I went back in 2010 as well. Um,
Oh, so you went back a second time.
I did. The second time was with a NATO party, and the chief political advisor to NATO had invited me, and so I was there with other people from other countries, and um, I recently wrote a really long, brand new chapter for Horse Soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
which that 2010 trip was incorporated in as well, because I tried to, when we came up to the 20-year mark of 9/11. I wanted to go back and just ask everyone, what was it all about? What did we lose and what did we win? And I interviewed, maybe 20 different people, diplomats, spies, soldiers,
Yeah.
generals, and it was very sobering. And Shannon Spann, about her then husband's Mike's death,
Mm-hmm.
and what did that mean? And J.R. Seeger, who's now a friend, and now, by the way, is retired from the CIA and is a novelist, a wonderful novelist, writing spy novels and steampunk
Oh really?
novels. And J.R. remains incredibly invaluable about what went on there, what's going on there today. So this, but going there kind of allowed me to talk with Shannon about that, because I was near the place where the attack. I stood in the place where the attack happened, and I could talk with JR then about what I had seen. And so you really have to, I mean, if you can, go to the place where the action has happened. I did the same with a book I wrote about the Vietnam War.
And that one is the Odyssey of Echo Company, correct?
Right. Yeah.
I'm about to hit up Amazon after our conversation here and get In Harm's Way and the Odyssey of Echo Company.
One thing people ask me is like, how did you come up with Horse Soldiers? And to be honest, when they deployed in 2001, they didn't have a name.
Right.
So the book really named them. They went by, they called themselves kind of unofficially the Regulators, after a Stephen King novel.
Oh yeah, the Regulators. Okay.
And so I'd worked on this book for 5 years, and my editor in chief at Scribner, Colin Harrison, we were talking about title. He said, let's call it the Horse Soldiers, and it stuck. And so that's in the new chapter I write about. There's a wonderful statue now at Ground Zero.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. and our family took part in the dedication, and so it's unofficially called the Horse Soldier Statue. And then they Mark Nooch and Bob Pennington, who's Cal Spencer in the book, and
Hmm.
a couple other people started a bourbon company called Horse Soldier Bourbon.
Yeah, that's the bourbon we've been highlighting
Yeah,
in this
I
4-part series.
I heard you. Yeah, but that comes from Colin coming up with the title, because
That's
the
awesome.
the idea of calling it the Regulators Bourbon would have been kind of a non-starter. But
Yeah, I mean that's really cool. I mean that's a great part of this conversation. Is I had no idea about that comes from your work as well, and then you have the bourbon now and the distillery, and that's a really cool connection.
yeah, Alex Hernandez, who was a CIA officer, a part of this pilot team, it's a fascinating career. He rides motorcycles around the country, and he'll stop in Michigan where I live, and I have a Ducati like Alex does, and so when he stops by, we go on a ride. But he's now become an ambassador for the bourbon too. So he'll ride around and go to different liquor stores, and they have stories where the soldiers will tell a war story, and they'll have the bourbon for sale. It's kind of interesting.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, Alex finally brought me a bottle of it, because no one had yet sent me one, and I like the stuff. It's really pretty good. He signed it for me. It was pretty cool.
Oh, that's really cool. I'm actually drinking a glass of it right now as I'm interviewing you for a little celebration for myself here.
Oh, good.
But the first place that I had tried the bourbon actually was out here in Galena, Illinois. My wife had a gift card from her cousin for Christmas, and we went to a small place on the strip in Galena, and it was part of their bourbon tasting. And that's actually my inspiration of buying your book and reading the story and then finding the bourbon as well. I really enjoyed it as well. So that's my take
Yeah.
on how I've come to interview you.
One thing I want to say is that the book and the movie focused really on one team, although I had pseudonyms in the book,
Correct.
because at the time the soldiers were uneasy about having their identities disclosed.
It makes sense, yes.
But they've since retired and moved beyond that. I mean, in 2010, as I talk about in this new chapter, I walked down Fifth Avenue behind the Horse Soldier statue
Mm-hmm.
with them in a parade. So obviously, the world had changed. And so I use pseudonyms, though, at their request, which is fine. However, if you're above, I think, the rank of major at the time, it'd still be true. You had to use your true name. So you'll see, like, Mark Mitchell is actually Mark Mitchell.
Correct. And Mulholland as well.
Yeah, and then, but Mark Nooch is actually Mitch Nelson.
Gotcha. Okay.
But in the book, there are two major teams. Dean Nosorogue is captain of ODA 534, and Mitch Nelson is captain of ODA 595. And they really both played a monumental role, along with their Afghan counterparts, in affecting this victory. And Dean and his team just really haven't received their share of the spotlight. To be honest, I don't think they want it. But I just wanted to point out that this wasn't just the 595 team that really, Dean and his crew, and actually Dean came to my house in Michigan for about 3 days, and we sat and I interviewed him, and then I went down to Fort Campbell and talked to a lot of the rest of his team. Just, they need to be called out too. And because the movie stops as they ride into Mazar Sharif, and does not cover the second half of the book.
Oh, wow. See, my wife and I were saying we didn't want to watch the movie until this podcast series was done. We didn't want to well, I already knew from reading her book, obviously, but we didn't want anything. She didn't want to spoil it for herself. So we are going to watch the movie very soon here.
Okay.
And that's a very interesting fact, is that so that's where the movie ends.
It ends with riding into Mazar Sharif, which is a big deal because that was their objective, to capture it.
Right.
Now, other things are going on there. Just by the way, for everyone, there are other teams now, other special forces teams, other quote ODAs, Operational Detachment Alpha, deployed around the country, that are fighting with their own Afghan counterparts to take ground in cities as well.
Sure.
So in this case, though, they take Mazar Sharif, and achieve their goal. And that's where the movie ended.
So I know we're short on time here, but I do want to just ask you that question really quick because you just mentioned it. What was it like to see your book turned into this Hollywood movie?
Well, it happened. It took 10 years, and then it happened all at once. Um, and I told Mark, and I told Bob and the crew that if they just were patient, they could, when they retired, they would have a speaking career, and and other things, good things would happen to them because of the publicity from the movie. And in fact, they started Horse Soldier Bourbon, and used the movie a lot to promote it.
Promote that.
So from that point of view, it was successful. From a personal point of view, just it was very satisfying because, like I said, it did not become a Rambo movie. I mean, Jerry Bruckheimer and Nikolai Fugelsig tried very hard to make this a movie about an American and an Afghan talking about how to achieve victory here. So while there's a lot of action, it really does get into the nuance of this, what's called unconventional warfare. And for those of us listening, I mean, that actually is a thing. It sounds like, but unconventional warfare is different from conventional warfare.
Absolutely.
Or it's called UW. And so, for Jerry Bruckheimer to make a movie about things where people are trying not to blow something up was a challenge. And so hats off to him for making this movie. And it was successful because it really was, and this is probably a great place to end. It really was a victory. And as I say, I wrote a book and there's a movie about the first 10 minutes of a 20-year war. But what it really showed was that how you could achieve victory, how you could work with partners, in a way that was more reminiscent of World War II and the OSS, those American trained guerrilla fighters dropped behind enemy lines in France to, work with the locals to then fight the Nazis. That's what happened here.
Yeah.
It worked. Now, what happened in Afghanistan is it got very big and it became a very, very different kind of war. So to talk about 2020 and 2001 is to talk about two different worlds. The regular army is not fond of and does not trust the unconventional army.
Right.
It's threatening because you do not have, if you deputize a young captain, special forces captain on the ground in Afghanistan as a response to the biggest terror attack in America, you deputize that person to make decisions, about the standing of the U.S. in the world by kneeling down the dirt and drawing with a stick, a plan with an Afghan warlord. That's a lot of responsibility and trust you place in that one person, and it's threatening to a more conventional army mindset. And I'm not. And in the new chapter, I talk about how that may have led to the fact that it just got to be a very big war. By its end, in a very different kind of war. So to see the movie was, so in other words, to see them take to make that kind of movie and to be on the set in Albuquerque, New Mexico, was really fun. And then to sit in the theater with my mom and my sister and my wife and our kids and just watch the movie start up. And Tom Brokaw was there.
That's amazing.
He came. He's just Tom Brokaw. When I wrote In Harm's Way, gave it an incredible boost. He has done so much for so many writers. We've since became friends. And then, Matt Damon came up and said to my mom, "You must be really proud of your son."
That's amazing.
Which is like very funny. And, so, and I just thought, what, this rarely happens to a writer, and this is really fun, and I'm just going to enjoy it. And
it's phenomenal.
For the moment it is, yeah.
I can't wait to watch it. I think I said in our first phone call, I'm embarrassed I haven't watched it yet because that's a movie that's like right in my, strike zone. And this whole story is just gone over my head, and it's not like me to miss a story like this. And I'm so glad that I came across the bourbon, and I'm very glad that I came across your book, because I have to say, and this is not me at all tooting your horn here, it is probably one of the best books that has put me so immersed into a story with so much detail, to where I actually just felt like I could picture what I was reading. And the comic relief in it, that dark humor we were talking about earlier, that just, that hit me right in the feels.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that. And it's just a great book, and I can't thank you enough for writing it, because honestly, it was something, as a history teacher and a history lover, that I really just enjoyed reading.
Thanks, Cody. That means a lot. And I wish you and Audrey well with the podcast.
I appreciate that.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me.
Well, Doug, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the History on the Rocks podcast to give us this interview. We really appreciate it.
All right. Take care. We'll see you again.
You as well.